I'm Lisa Shepard, and I am the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. The mission of the CJCP is to enhance professionalism among North Carolina lawyers, judges, and law students, a mission which it has been doing since 1998. One of the ways that the CJCP does this is to sponsor this historical video series, which is a collection of video interviews of distinguished lawyers, judges, and professionals from across North Carolina. The CJCP began filming these video interviews in 2000 as a means to preserve the thoughts of these bar leaders on the legal profession and on professionalism issues. All of the videos in this series are available to you on the CJCP website and the CJCP's dedicated YouTube channel. We are so fortunate to have had many distinguished members of the North Carolina Bar over the years, and they have much accumulated wisdom to share with us. It is important to understand that the practice of law is a profession, and doing it well requires not only substantive knowledge that one gains in law school and from studying for the bar exam, but also the value of experience learned from other lawyers. I hope that this video series will give you not only a fresh insight into the person being interviewed, but also some meaningful information about how to be a better lawyer in your own practice. Enjoy, and remember, esse quam videri. Strive to be professional in all that you do, rather than to merely seem so.
I have the great honor of presenting the Chief Justice's Professionalism Award, the annual distinction for a member of our legal community who has significantly demonstrated the many attributes of professionalism throughout his or her career. These attributes include the overall quality of performance in the law, community and public service, service to local, state, and national bar associations, and the earned respect of our judges, legal scholars, lawyers, and leaders outside our profession. As most of you know, the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism was formed in 1998 with the charge to enhance professionalism among judges, lawyers, and law students in North Carolina. Over the past few years, the Commission has embarked on a number of very worthwhile projects, including this award. Many of you in this room tonight have been directly involved with the Commission's initiatives, and you are to be applauded for your dedication to professionalism. The award tonight goes to a much beloved judge, lawyer, educator, and friend who has espoused all of the qualities and characteristics our profession honors. 2004 has already been quite a year for our recipient, as he was also presented in June with the North Carolina Bar Association's Judge John J. Parker Award, which, as you know, is one of the highest awards of the bar. There are many truly great lawyers in North Carolina who are deserving of this award, but there is no one more deserving than this year's recipient. I am very pleased and proud to name this year's recipient Robinson O. Everett. Thank you very much. But I would like to share with you a few specific things about a man who epitomizes the term for which this award is given. Robbie graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 1947 at the age of 19, where he was a Wendell Scholar. He then attended Harvard Law School, where he served 2 years on the Harvard Law Review and graduated magna cum laude. in 1950. In September of 1950, at the age of 22, Robbie joined Duke Law School as an assistant professor and went on to serve with the Air Force during the Korean War with the Judge Advocate General Corps. He rejoined the Duke Law faculty in 1956 on a part-time basis, earned his Master of Laws degree in 1959, and became a tenured professor in 1967, continuing to so serve to this day. As a member of the Air Force Reserve, he was a commissioner for the United States Court of Military Appeals, while also practicing law in Durham with the family firm of Everett and Everett until 1980, and serving as a member of the Duke Law faculty. In 1980, President Carter nominated him to the United States Court of Military Appeals, where he served as Chief Judge until 1990, and still serves as a senior judge for the Court of Appeals for the Armed Services. Robbie has served the organized bar, Duke Law School, his state, and the armed forces by selflessly giving of his time and talents. Within the bar, he has served as president of the Durham Bar Association, the North Carolina Bar Association, and as counselor of the North Carolina State Bar. He was chairman of the North Carolina IOTA Board of Trustees and is chairman of the Standing Committee on Legal Assistance to Military Personnel. He is a member of many American bar groups, has chaired many committees and sections for the Federal Bar Association, is a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and was the director of the American Judicature Society. He has received numerous awards and distinctions for his service and dedication to the bar, Duke Law School, the public, and the military. As a lawyer, Robbie has regularly taken the General Assembly to court. Now, I like that. Especially. And he has argued successfully before the United States Supreme Court, challenging the constitutionality of newly drawn congressional districts. He remains active in redistricting, litigation, and education. He served as a counsel and consultant to the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights of the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, leading to the Military Justice Act of 1968. He also served as a lecturer on military justice to the Army Judge Advocate General School and other groups, and is founder of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at Duke Law School. Robbie is also a writer and editor. He published a military justice textbook and has written numerous articles on military law, criminal procedure, evidence, and other legal topics. Robbie Everett has exceeded all professionalism expectations and has set an extraordinary example for all in our profession to follow. As Chief Justice of your Supreme Court, I now proudly present and introduce to you the 2004 recipient of the Chief Justice's Professionalism Award, Robinson O. Everett. Robbie, come forward.
Welcome to the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism historical video series. Today, our guest is the Honorable Robinson O. Everett, former Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Services, a longtime practitioner, and I believe the man who has taught law at Duke University Law School longer than anyone else. I'm Bill Creech, William A. Creech. I am an emergency district court judge.
Well, it's certainly an honor to be interviewed by you and to talk with you, Bill.
His father was one of the most distinguished members of the bar in North Carolina, was one of the most distinguished North Carolinians of his era, as was his mother. They were an amazing couple, and they produced an amazing son.
Well, they were amazing. I don't know about the son.
Well, They were amazing, and I think about their many attributes and the contributions they made over the years.
Bill, let me mention a little bit in detail about Mother and Dad. My father was admitted to the bar in 1905 and practiced. He was in his office when he died in 1971. So he hung in there as a lawyer for a long, long time, and I think he really loved it. My mother, she was admitted to the bar in 1920, was one of the first women to be admitted to the bar, and she practiced until she retired in 1990. That's 70 years. I hated it when she retired. I thought she should keep on a little bit longer. But I think they both enjoyed it and had enthusiasm for the practice of law and the opportunity to render service. And I was their only child, and sort of reared under those circumstances. I think it was inevitable that I would be a lawyer and try to follow in their footsteps.
Your father, I believe, was one of the first students at the law school at Duke University.
My dad had come to Durham as a teacher after finishing at Carolina, and he decided to read law and then took the bar exam and became a lawyer, and a fairly prominent lawyer very quickly.
But he was the first city attorney in Durham, wasn't he?
I think that's right, yeah.
And then your mother, talking about successful attorneys, was the first woman to win a case before the North Carolina Supreme Court.
I've never understood how it happened, because she became a member of the bar in the summer of 1920, and she argued an appeal to the Supreme Court that fall and won it, I think, in October. Cases don't get that far that fast nowadays.
I remember that she said the first time she came before the North Carolina Supreme Court, they had never had a woman appear before the Supreme Court before. I believe that's correct.
I think that's right.
And there was some controversy over how she should be dressed. And she wore a hat and gloves, and then when she stood to address the court, she removed her gloves, I believe this is correct, and hat. I think that's the way it was, but ladies were supposed to wear hats and gloves.
What she finally wore when she argued the case, I don't know.
The first book that you wrote, that I recall, if I'm recalling it properly, was back in the mid-50s when you had been serving as a JAG officer, as a young lawyer in the Air Force. And then you wrote the first book, I believe, that was written about the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Is that correct?
What happened basically was this. I taught at Duke for a year, 1950-51, right out of law school. But I was in the Air Force Reserve as a JAG. I was ordered to active duty during the Korean War, and spent 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years, in the Air Force on active duty. Then I moved into reserve status and spent the next 26 years in the reserve. But anyway, I happened to be in Washington. I was seeking to be admitted to the bar of the Court of Military Appeals, as that court was then known. They've changed the name now to Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. And I went in, was sworn in as a member of the bar, and then the judge who swore me in said, Lieutenant Everett, I'd like to talk to you about something. I didn't know what was coming up, but it was very nice. Here's this distinguished judge who wanted to talk to me. And he then called in the clerk of court and explained to me that there had just been a position in his chambers which had become vacant, and he wondered whether I would be interested in serving. At that point, I had a sort of a tentative commitment to come back and practice law in Durham, but I thought this was going to be very interesting. He said, you'll be a commissioner in my chambers. And I said, well, what is a commissioner? He said, well, the clerk can explain that. And the clerk of court said, well, the commissioner is a GS-13. And I said, what is a GS-13? And the clerk said, well, that's sort of like being between a major and lieutenant colonel. And there I was, a lieutenant. I thought that's going to be a great jump promotion. So I called back to North Carolina, asked them to keep the position open and let me stay up there in Washington for a while. I stayed there, And the cases we had were so interesting that I ultimately tried to put them together in a book, the legal issues we dealt with, and wrote a book called it was called the Military Justice in the Armed Forces of the United States. I discovered writing the book was simple compared with getting it published. At that time, it was, you didn't have all the outlets for legal publications that we have today. But ultimately that was published, and that was in 1956, and it was a treatise written. I had it in fairly simple terms so the layperson could understand it. And I had footnotes with a lot of the legal citations and some of the more legalistic material. And I look back at it occasionally, and I think it was really worthwhile because the Uniform Code of Military Justice took effect in 1951. It was only in effect for a short time at that point, and so I wrote about it. I didn't realize that at a later time I'd be the chief judge of that court where I'd been employed as a commissioner. But
well, not only did you serve as a judge and as chief judge of that court, you also, I believe now, are a life member as a commissioner on the uniform state laws.
I became a life member in the mid-'80s. I think that requires 20 years, so by now I've got almost 40 years. And that's a very worthwhile organization, composed of commissioners from every state, and we get together annually and try to formulate uniform laws, proposed uniform laws for adoption by the various states.
Yes. Well, I just am always amazed that you have had the time to do the things that you have done, and I've always been absolutely amazed at your mental dexterity and the way you can jump from Durham to Washington, D.C. and commute and teach courses at Duke and serve as counsel to Senator Ervin's subcommittee on constitutional rights and be really the paramount staff person who assisted the senator with the studies of the constitutional rights of military personnel. And you made such an invaluable contribution there. I know Senator Everett was always very appreciative of all the hard work you did and the great leadership you gave to that study.
Well, Bill, you're mighty kind. I think in the interest of full disclosure, I should reiterate that you were the chief counsel of Senator Ervin. You actually hired me, and I couldn't do it on a full-time basis, but split time between Durham and Washington. And working for Senator Ervin was a wonderful experience. And also, I felt that we were rendering a real service trying to, in this instance, protect the constitutional rights of military personnel. I remember we went to Europe and looked at conditions as they existed there for American troops. Did a whole lot of things. And then in turn, Senator Ervin introduced, I think there were 18 different bills to reform the military justice system and improve it. And in 1968, thanks to his efforts, there was a revision of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which really upgraded the system.
Well, I'm certain Senator Ervin would agree with my saying this, that absolutely no one made a finer contribution or a greater contribution to that effort than Robinson Everett.
He had a remarkable record, and he was, a lot of people don't realize it, but he made a tremendous contribution to the legal system in the United States. And you talk about somebody being a professional, he really was. He had been a trial judge, he'd been a Superior Court judge, I believe, and a Supreme Court judge in North Carolina. He was in the state legislature, and he was there when my father was serving as a legislator, and they were friends. And he was just a great guy. We learned a lot from him, didn't we?
Absolutely. We've had some wonderful teachers. Your parents, and Senator Ervin being right at the top of the list. And I was just trying to think, to me, it is so absolutely amazing that you've had time to do all the things you've done. Now, I think we should put things in proper perspective by saying that you continued to teach at Duke during the years you served in Washington. Isn't that true?
That's right.
And so you have had an ongoing professorship at Duke University Law School for over 40 years. Isn't that correct?
I think probably 45, something like
45.
that. More than 45.
Yes. But now the first year you taught there, how old were you? 22?
I was 22.
22 years old.
Most of my students were veterans, and they were older than I was. And it was sort of embarrassing, you know.
You didn't tell them how old you were.
I think they knew. But they treated me with respect nevertheless. It was sort of difficult, too, trying to date young ladies who were students
Yes.
in that area. Not at Duke, I mean, but undergraduates there.
Yes.
But I had a great time that 1 year, but in a way, when I was ordered to active duty, I felt a sense of relief. And I had no anticipation at that time that I would ever return to teaching. But 5 years later, I was asked to do so, and Duke was very generous in that they allowed me to engage in law practice with my parents. We had a family firm, Everett. And it sounded like the secretary stuttered, but a great environment. And over the years, they've been very generous in allowing me to do some other things. As, for example, during the more than 10 years that I was chief judge up in Washington, I was only teaching, I was on a partial leave, and was only teaching a seminar on a Monday morning, as I recall, anyway, on a Monday. And then I would fly up to Washington, stay for the week, make sure we got the work out, and then come back to Durham, be with my family over the weekend, teach on Monday and go back up. But I've been able to blend a number of things, and I've had a lot of fun with them. And law has so many different aspects, so many challenges, so many ways you can be of service. Some people would feel that I spent about 10 years doing a disservice in the 90s, attacking the redistricting in North Carolina, going up to the Supreme Court 4 times.
I think that that is very interesting, because I recall the first redistricting case you filed was back in 1966.
And the indirect plaintiff was William A. Creek.
Yeah, that's right. And that you were successful then, and of course I think you've been successful in each of these instances, and the Supreme Court of the United States has certainly been very supportive of your points of view.
Well, they have been. I think, unfortunately, they've allowed some potential for evasion of the principles that we established. But nevertheless, I feel it was a worthwhile effort. And one of the nice things about being a lawyer is that you occasionally have opportunities to do something that will be very far-reaching, and where you can hopefully bring about a result that will make things better for everybody.
You have engaged in innumerable business activities, too many for me to try to mention here today. But primarily I would focus on your real estate investments and your apartment house projects and your shopping centers and your television stations. And to think that you've been in broadcasting and in television, and you've gone literally from coast to coast with it.
Well, you know, it is sort of interesting. Things lead from one place to another, and I was an associate editor for a publication at Duke called Law and Contemporary Problems. And as associate editor, I would have the responsibility for putting, I think, 1 or 2 symposia together every year. And this publication, which began at Duke in the 1930s, was unique at that time. And I did a symposium in the late 50s, early 60s on radio and TV, 2-part, and learned a little bit about radio and TV as a result of editing these different articles. In fact, one of them I almost ghost wrote. But anyway, that knowledge came to the fore in 1966. I read in the Durham newspaper that someone was going to apply for a TV license for a UHF station in Durham, allocated to Durham. And this was a gentleman who had already had another station in Charlotte. And from what I knew about it, it just didn't seem to be the sort of station that would be in the interest of Durham. I'm a Durham native, I've lived there all my life, and I thought, this isn't good. We ought to put together a local group to make the application. And so this gentleman was going to file in a week. He was giving it notice. And during that same week, we were able to put together a unique team. Former mayor of Raleigh, former mayor of Durham, former mayor of Chapel Hill, all of whom had TV or radio experience. One of the most prominent African-American citizens in our area, or really in the country at the time, who was a friend of Lyndon Johnson, who was president. We had the dream team. My mother, who was serving on the city council, she served 20 years there in Durham. And we went ahead and applied. In fact, we got the application together, and I hand carried it up to Washington. We filed it before the other person, and ultimately got the station. And it went on the air in 1968, the same day of the election, as I recall, of that year, in November. And then continued, and that led to some other things. We applied to the FCC to have a rule change made, which played a major role in fostering UHF TV. So, you know, these things branched out, but the starting point was the work I had done in compiling that symposium on radio and TV.
I recall that many years ago, I think it was back during the maybe late 50s or 60s, that you were chairman of Urban Renewal in Durham.
Urban Redevelopment Commission.
That's right, and that was a very demanding position in those days.
Very challenging, and I think there's some people in Durham who would say that we'd been better off not doing the urban renewal. I disagree. I think we did some excellent urban renewal. Ironically, my own home was taken and demolished in urban renewal. I remember driving past my home one day on the way to the airport and looked to the right. There was a bulldozer sitting right in the middle of where our house had been. But it was an opportunity to serve, and we had some excellent people serving on our commission. There were 5 of us. It changed, but I was chair for about 10 years, as I recall, maybe 15.
Well, you certainly couldn't be accused of favoritism when you sacrificed your own home.
No, as a matter of fact, somebody said, can't you figure out some way to preserve your home? And I said, absolutely not. I mean, I couldn't have homes of others demolished and try to preserve.
Well, talking about preserving homes, I think that your interest in historic preservation and your dedication to the law tie in not only so closely with both of your parents, but I think of your father and of what he has done for this state in preserving the Bennett House.
Well, an interesting thing about my dad, this is apropos of professionalism, he was, as you say, very aristocratic in appearance. He'd been a farm boy down in Martin County and came up to Chapel Hill and then read law at Duke. But he also felt a professional responsibility to represent people who otherwise couldn't get representation. And he did a lot of death cases. I remember my mother telling me about how when I was a small baby, I guess, right about that time, father was trying a case over in, I believe it was Henderson. And she got a call from the Associated Press, and they said, has Mr. Everett come home? And she said, he hadn't reached here yet. Why are you calling? They said, well, people were shooting at him when he left court. And he had gone over to represent this young African-American who was charged with some offense which was particularly heinous at that time. And I guess, I don't know if it was a rape of white woman or what. But and he also had with him two African-American attorneys who had just started to practice in Durham, and the three of them were defending this guy. And I talked to him about it later, and he said they didn't know whether they were shooting at him or it was a backfire from the car, but he had told the other two lawyers to get down in the back of the seat, and they get out of there. And the case was still going on, and they were concerned about going back the next day. And he said, we got to go back. We can't let people frighten you away from doing your duty. We've got to go back. We may not win, probably won't, but we've got to go back there. And so they did. And he handled some cases where, they were not popular cases, I'll put it that way. He represented a lot of people who were not privileged. He represented a lot of them where he got no fee at all. I remember we had a guy practicing with us at one point when they were talking about establishing a legal aid program in Durham for the indigent. He said, jokingly said, why do they need that? They've got our law firm. But my dad was committed to that, and I think that was tremendously important.
Well, I think his commitment not only was circumscribed to the law, but to people in general. I think about the contribution that he and his brothers made. I believe each of them served in the General Assembly, didn't they?
Well, they really set an example, and I think it's always helpful if you have somebody who's in your family or a friend or otherwise a teacher in law school who can be your mentor and help you out so they give you some guidance. One thing I enjoy about teaching is the opportunity to establish a relation with some of the students and try to be a mentor. Some of them are like members of the family. We had one student a year or two ago, and his mother, who later died, she wrote me a note. I've seldom seen anything like it, where she expressed gratitude because we'd taken her son in and provided family setting, and he was under a lot of stress. And then I remember once she called me later, and she said, my son is in the emergency room at Duke. Apparently he had was going to have an appendectomy. She didn't know what had happened, but she said, I can't come down. I think it was severe leukemia. She was about to die, and said, would you check and call and see what happened? So I went over to the emergency room and found out he was awaiting an almost immediate appendectomy. Something had happened, and then I called her and told her and reassured her. But you know, that's one of the things, if you can, with a student, if you're teaching, or with a client in practice, if you can reassure them, help them out, it gives you a great feeling. And maybe you don't make any money out of it, but you get that feeling you've accomplished something.
One thing that we really haven't touched on is the center that you established on law, ethics, and national security at Duke Law School. And I think it's very interesting because it was the first center of that sort established. I believe the only one I was familiar with before was at the University of Virginia.
Right. Now, prelude to that was that I was teaching national security law and teaching it at Duke. Then I was invited to do that at Carolina and Wake Forest, and did so. So at one point, I was teaching at 3 law schools in that area. But as I got into the subject matter and thought there's so many legal issues and ethical issues that have implications for national security, it would really be worthwhile to have a center to study those, and where better than at the Duke Law School.
And you brought so many interesting speakers there, and you've had so many interesting programs during a relatively short time, and to think the director you have, Scott Silliman, has made such an enormously fine contribution.
He has a tremendous impact. He's on TV all the time.
And then you have continued, though, to have classes at Wake Forest and Chapel Hill, have you not?
I think at Wake, the distance factor began to present a problem. I think they've got some people there who are continuing it. They brought some people on faculty who could do it.
But you did commute for a while,
time.
and you and Scott Sullivan also, both of you taught there.
Right.
Is that not correct?
And Scott is currently teaching at Duke, Carolina, and North Carolina Central. So we're able to spread the message and trying to alert students to some of the legal challenges. We have a spring conference at Duke. Then we participate with the American Bar and with the National Security Law Center at UVA in an annual conference in the fall, sort of an update on what's happening, be it terrorism or military commissions.
Well, you have a symposium tomorrow, don't you, at Duke? The Robinson O. Everett Symposium, isn't that tomorrow?
Walter Cox, who succeeded me as chief judge once removed, he put it together, and he thought this question of how lawyers should deal with issues of white-collar crime and with clients like Martha Stewart.
Certainly a timely consideration.
Yeah, it's very timely, and he put it together for tomorrow afternoon, and his law firm, Nelson Mullins, is actually funding it, and so there are a number of speakers who are going to be talking about it, and he decided to call it the Robinson O. Everett Symposium, which I appreciate. Don't deserve it, but I appreciate it.
Well, I would say this, that if you weren't very much agreed that you deserved it, they wouldn't have done it.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
Well, you know, it's very difficult as we reflect upon a life such as yours to realize that you're still a young man and that you're still doing all these things. And it's just absolutely incredible to me to think that anyone has had the mental agility and dexterity and perseverance to do all the things that you've done.
Really?
And I think you had such sterling examples in your parents, certainly.
Well, I'm going to see if I can. I'm going to try to match my mother. I don't think I'll make it to 97 in my law office, but I'll give it a try.
Now, I recall that just a few weeks ago, you received the Judge John Parker Award. Is that not correct?
That was received from the North Carolina Bar Association.
For the outstanding contribution you've made to the bar.
I think
as a practitioner and as a member, how many committees do you serve on for the Bar Association?
Well, I've served in not so many of the Bar Association, primarily with the State Bar. I've chaired the LAMP committee really from the time that it was started. That's legal assistance to military personnel. At one time, I chaired the CLE commission, a board. At an earlier time, I chaired IOLTA. I was a bar counselor for a while and was president of the Durham Bar. So I've tried to be active in professional groups. I've tried to be very active going to Bar Association meetings, and my parents and I had probably the most extensive record of attendance at ABA meetings of anybody in America. I'm serving now on the ABA Standing Committee on Armed Forces Law, and am a counselor for the ABA Committee on National Law and National Security. So I've tried to be involved in that. Bill, I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunity over the years to practice law in a number of different settings. I practiced with my mother and dad, and I believe in family firms. It's a great opportunity. You build together, you share, and I practiced with mother and dad for 20 years, I guess. During that same time, I got involved in a Raleigh office, and you and I practiced together. We had a Raleigh office. That was during some of the time that you were running for Congress, among other things.
And you've had an office in Washington, D.C.
Oh, I did. I sort of had an office in Washington, and
but now today you have offices in Durham and in Raleigh. Do you have an office still in Washington?
In Raleigh, I am of counsel to Everett Gaskins, so I have a chance to be here in the capital city and do some practice. I had a couple of interesting experiences. I was actually a partner briefly and of counsel with the Patton Boggs firm when it was getting underway, a big Washington firm which at one point had offices in Greensboro, and the Patton was a young man, when this was happening, was a young man named Jim Patton from Durham. We'd been longtime friends, and I got a chance to see a law firm start up there in the capital city, and that was interesting. And then at one point, 4 or 5 years ago, I was of counsel to the Cadwalader Wickersham Taft firm, the oldest firm in Wall Street. They were establishing a law office in Charlotte, and I basically was involved in establishing that office. And that was interesting also to see one of these big firms from the inside and to see what the culture is like. I think I'm much more oriented to the small firm, but whatever, and this would be my suggestion for law students, that they consider carefully all the alternatives, that they not be too enthralled by the high salaries they can get with the really large firms, because there is a significant sacrifice in terms of time, effort, involvement, frequently an inability to do some of the other things they would like to do. Now I realize the debt that they acquire going to law school may have to shape their choices, but it's interesting that law schools like Duke and many others are now encouraging students to go into public interest-oriented activities with a view to, well, they're giving them some subsidies, helping them pay off their loans so that lawyers will have more, law students and lawyers will have more options. One interesting type of career, and one that I enjoyed while I was in it, was as a judge advocate. And I think that it's worthwhile for law students and young lawyers to consider the opportunity the military offers. Also, in various types of government agencies, there may be opportunities for a lawyer, perhaps to serve in the legal counsel's office of CIA or the FBI or something of that sort.
Or district attorneys' offices. The district attorneys throughout the state employ so many young lawyers, and they give opportunities to so many law students to come in as interns.
And I've had some law students who went into the FBI. Their legal training helped them in FBI careers. So there are so many alternatives, and I think that it's very important that the law student and the young lawyer really consider all the various activities. Now, some are entrepreneurial, and I've had some law students who have made a lot of, who've done well in practice, but then have gone into business in one form or another and have made a lot of money at it. And that's another alternative that is worth pursuing. Some very interesting challenges. Ironically, I currently have a 1L student who was in business for 17 years, sold his business, and now has gone into law. And I've had some law students who were interested in theology and became either full-time or part-time pastors or ministers. So that I think one of the most important things is that a lawyer or a law student early in life not rush too quickly into a particular field of law, that they really weigh the choices.
Well, do you feel that law schools might make a even greater contribution to their students if they were to have a night curriculum? For instance, I know that Georgetown was begun as a night law school because the students invariably worked during the day and studied law at night. And of course, I think that has become a very prestigious law school.
Well, I think North Carolina Central has
And North Carolina
night
Central
program.
does that.
And I understand that's quite good.
But it's the only one, I believe, in the state.
I think you're
North
right.
Carolina Central.
There's some new law schools that are in contemplation. I don't know whether they're going to do that
I
or
understand
not.
Elon's thinking about one in Greensboro.
That's what I understood. One other thing that's interesting, I think, is worthwhile, is for the law students at least, and the young lawyers for that matter, to get involved in Inns of Court and things of that type, where they have an opportunity to interface with the senior attorney.
And you have done that at Duke. I know you were the movant behind establishing the Braxton Craven Inn of Court at Duke.
And I think it's been very successful.
Yes.
And I think also the one at Wake Forest has worked well. I had a slight role in that. And so I think that it's very important for the young lawyer to try to look to opportunities for being mentored by the more senior lawyers. And I think for senior lawyers, it's very much worthwhile considering how they can render service for younger lawyers, provide guidance and so forth. Because the law field, law is such a great profession that with so many opportunities that it's important to make sure that everybody practicing fully understands those opportunities and participates.
Well, I think that's one of your great contributions that you've made to your students, that they know not only are you a professor of law, but you've had all this practical experience in business and government, and that you can bring a new dimension to their appreciation of the law, and hopefully when they go out into the world to practice it, they will bring in other avenues and make it a broader concept.
Well, I hope I can contribute in that way. At least I try to do so. And
well, we want to thank you very much for giving us all this time. And I'm sorry you had to rush through class this morning in order to be here, but we are most grateful to you.
Thank you, Bill. Fun to be with you.
Good morning. Welcome to Carolina People. This morning we're at the Fox 43 studio. We're focused on the life of a Carolinian who's been practicing law more than 5 decades, Robinson Oscar Everett, my dad. Good morning, Dad. How are you?
Well, I tell you, Craig, it's great to be with you, to be here being interviewed by my own son. My goodness.
I tell you, it's kind of strange. You know, it was so exciting to kick off this week, kick off yesterday with Mickey Spillane, and to go the next few days with you. And I know folks are thinking, why the heck's he interviewing his dad for a few days? And I tell you, one of the thrills was last week's Myrtle Beach Herald came out, and we were able to reprint the introductory remarks from an attorney in Charlotte, Norfleet Pruden, the past president of the North Carolina Bar Association. Some of his comments leading into the introduction for the John J. Parker Award, which was given back on June 19th up at the Grove Park Inn. And if any viewers, of course, viewers in the PD or southeastern North Carolina are able to get a copy of the Myrtle Beach Herald, to go online at myrtlebeachherald.com, they'll be able to read and get an idea as to why we're highlighting you for a couple days.
Well, you're mighty generous, and they were too.
They really were. That's right. It was very special. Dad, real quick, you know, I never asked you that. As a child, did you always have plans to be a lawyer?
Absolutely not. I was going to try to be a detective. I thought that would be exciting. Then I got to college. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then right at the end of college, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't have a job. I thought, well, my mother and dad, they're both lawyers. They'll hire me if I learn law. So I applied to law school and got in, did okay, and the rest is history.
So you were finishing college and still had no idea, truly had no idea. You're saying during your entire youth, while both your parents are lawyers, you're hanging out at the court or you're hanging out at home, you never aspired to be an attorney?
Not really. At one time when I was studying courses in international relations, I said, well, I'd like to be an international lawyer.
Right.
I didn't know what that meant, and there weren't very many of them. If I'd gone forward on that, I don't think I'd have gotten anywhere. And then a friend of mine was going over, I was at Harvard, and a friend of mine was going over to the Harvard Law School, and he said, you ever been over there? I said, no. He said, walk over with me. I said, why are you going? He said, I'm going to apply to law school. I said, I'll walk over there with you. I walked over, he applied. Seemed like a good idea, so I applied. At that time, it was a lot easier to get in than it is now. This was right at the end of World War II, and they hadn't had that influx of veterans yet. And I was able to get in and went.
That's amazing. And not only went, Dad, I think you finished up, what, fourth in a class of 400 some?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah,
But
not too bad.
I did okay.
Right.
I was lucky.
You know, it was so exciting. I was reading an article you'd done on your mother in fall of 1994 for the North Carolina Bar Quarterly, highlighting women in the legal profession. And in there, you talked about her having great secretarial skills as well as being a great brief writer. And there was an experience during law school where I think you had hepatitis.
Yeah.
And she was up there and was able to sit in, and there was you talk about in that article Dean Irwin Griswold. Can you share with the viewers a little bit about that story? I know that jumps forward a little bit. I want to get back to your youth, but...
Well, I was sick, couldn't go to class, and my mother knew shorthand. She'd worked with her father, who was a lawyer. She was sort of the office secretary, and then she became a lawyer and practiced with him. But anyhow, she knew shorthand. I wasn't going to be able to go to class. She was up there at Harvard with me, trying to take care of me. And so I said, Mom, would you go over and attend the classes and take notes? So she did. The only problem was that it was an all-male institution at that time. There were no women at the Harvard Law School. So she shows up to take notes, and Dean Griswold, who taught the course I was taking at that time on tax law, he had a woman reporter in there shortly before who'd written a story that apparently he didn't like. And he thought my mother was some kind of reporter. And he was getting ready to throw her out when one of my fellow students said, Dean, she's not a reporter, she's just taking notes for her son who couldn't be here, he's sick. And so he let her stay. She took notes. I did very well that semester. She took a lot better notes than I did.
I'm sure she did. That's great, Dad. That's a great story. You know, it was so exciting. It was amazing going through trying to prep. I mean, how do you prep for many interviews? How do you prep for a parent? I mean, how do you go through preparing for a mother or a father? If you're proud of them, whoever it is, it's kind of difficult. I got to say, one of the great things I was able to do over the last couple of days was to go back to some articles written about you, or some other things you'd written that enabled me to get a fresh perspective of you. There was a great piece in the Raleigh News and Observer in '93 when you were recognized, I think, as the Tar Heel of the Week, and it helped give me a good feel looking back at your life, and talked a little bit about your youth. Can you share with the viewers a little bit about what it was like growing up in Durham in the 30s and early 40s?
Well, I was an only child, and so I probably got a lot better care than most. I went to Durham High School. At that time, that was the best high school in North Carolina, probably. And we usually did well in statewide competitions. We had a great basketball and football team. Durham was primarily a tobacco town. If I were walking home from school, I'd walk right past the tobacco factory, and the odor of tobacco, the smell of tobacco was everywhere. Durham had Duke University, which was an outstanding school, but not like it is today, not world famous. And my parents knew some of the professors, so I got to meet some professors early on. So it was an interesting academic atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that at that point, Durham was probably racially split about 2 to 1 white to African American. Unlike today, there were no Hispanics as a practical matter. It was a quiet town. We had 4 or 5 movie theaters, and I loved to go to them. I went to a lot of movies. That was the main entertainment. We didn't seem to have as much crime as in a later time. Nobody was worried about drugs then. They didn't know what coke was, or heroin, or marijuana. It was a pretty quiet and peaceful environment.
Dad, now neither of your parents were actually raised in Durham, but both had lived there for quite a while, I guess.
Oh, yeah, my dad had been reared on a farm down in eastern North Carolina. He was one of the first 5 law students at Trinity College, which later became Duke. So Duke says he was one of their first 5 law students. When he finished college at Carolina, he came to Duke. He came to Durham as a teacher, and he read law, and then he qualified as a lawyer, and he liked Durham. He stayed there. So he got there in 1903, and along about 1924, he went to a bar meeting, a bar association meeting, and met a young lady lawyer who happened to be my mother. She was practicing with her dad in Fayetteville, where she'd been raised, and they met, and 2 years later got married. So then she moved up to Durham, and that meant she was about 23 years later than him getting there. But they both liked it and stayed, and mother had quite a career there. She was on the city council. My dad was in the state legislature from Durham. They developed a lot of roots there. And so for me, staying in Durham really seemed to be the only choice.
So you finished law school and came straight back to Durham?
Actually, I did. I came back to do something I never had expected to do, namely to teach law at Duke Law School. A friend of my dad was at the time the university counsel at Duke.
Right.
And they had a vacancy. They needed somebody had just left. And so they asked me to teach. And there I was, age 22, trying to teach law.
At age 22?
Yeah, I was the youngest law teacher they've ever had, by far. And it was an interesting experience.
What was that like, Dad? Most of your students, or all of your students, would have been older than you.
Probably 95%.
That's insane.
It's a challenge.
I'm sure. I know. I can't imagine that. I mean, when we think now, of course, so many folks are finishing college at age 21 or 22, to then have gone through. Now, how were you able to do that? Did you skip some grades early on, or?
Yeah, I skipped. I skipped a grade in college, and I started school early, and I skipped a couple of grades in high school.
Okay.
So I entered law school at age 19, finished at 22, and went on from there.
Well, you know, I hear that story about you actually finishing high school, and then because you were so young, I believe going off to is it Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire for a year?
Yeah.
And then I think I saw that you came back expecting to go to UNC, Chapel Hill, and started at Chapel Hill.
Sure did.
And I think that, am I correct that you began pledging a fraternity?
I was an ATO.
Is that right? So you began pledging a fraternity and maybe had a little too much fun?
I had too much fun. My parents said, you're not going to stay here anymore. You're going to go up to Harvard. Because I'd done this extra work at Exeter, I qualified for admission at Harvard. It was sort of a feeder school.
Right.
And so I went up there, and they treated me not as a post-grad, but as just a member of the class of 1944.
Right.
So I wound up graduating there. I graduated in 1943 at Durham High, and I go to the reunions of the 1943 class when I graduated, and the 45 class when I would have graduated.
Wow, which will be coming up next year. That's amazing.
Yeah, they're all very good to me.
Yeah, I know, Dad. They must be. You know, it was so exciting to go back and to try to look back, as I said, going back to some articles written about you, going back to some things you've written on your own, to see some memories that are hashed up, and a lot of them go back when you talk about your mother. And can you share with the viewers a little bit about, because, and I know this is about you, but it's so exciting since your mother, my grandmother, started practice in 1920, I believe.
That's right.
The same year that women got the right to vote.
Oh, that's very true. She got a law license the same year. And not only that, she graduated #1 in her class at law school.
Wow.
And she was #1 to take the bar exam. She had a remarkable career. I think she was a vice president of the North Carolina Bar Association 3 or 4 years after she got admitted to the bar. She was always active in the bar. She was one of the first 2 women city council members in Durham. She was the president of all sorts of organizations, business and professional women, Daughters of the Confederacy, et cetera, et cetera. Very active in the church. She was one of the first women elders in the, what was then Southern Presbyterian Church. Or maybe they'd merged by then, the Northern and Southern. There's an interesting story there. I nominated my mother to be an elder. I didn't know that under the rules of the Southern Presbyterian Church, they had no women elders. The Northern Presbyterian Church did. And when I was in the military, I'd been out of West Texas and went to a Northern Presbyterian Church. So we're having a congregational meeting, and I went ahead and nominated her, and thinking she'd be a great elder. She was very dedicated and so forth. And there was a long silence, and somebody said, "You can't do that. She's a woman." And I said, "Well, I thought you could. I've been to churches where women served as elders and deacons, and I thought that was okay." And again, a long silence, and one of the members of the congregation, who was very active, said, "Well, women should be allowed to serve, and so I'm going to move that our church make an overture to the presbytery and on up to the synod and the General Assembly that the book of church ought to be changed to allow women to be pastors, elders, deacons." And that in turn happened. Our congregation made that overture. That was the overture that moved forward. It takes time, several years. And in fact, I think it was 40 years ago when they first allowed women to serve as elders in the Southern Presbyterian Church. But it all began there, really, with the nomination of my mother. And I guess it's one of those things where sometimes you do something in ignorance that turns out okay.
Right. Golly, Dad. And sometimes you do things very directly that turn out okay as well. You know, and that makes me think, and of course it's so exciting you talked about that Tar Heel of the Week piece. Primarily it was highlighted because of your insistence of pursuing a fight for a colorblind society and working hard and launching a series of cases that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I go back to this piece from the article, the Tar Heel of the Week, striving for a colorblind society. A self-described moderate Democrat, Everett does not seem like the gadfly type, a friendly man who bears a passing resemblance to Alfred Hitchcock. Everett lives in a ground floor unit of a bland apartment complex not far from Duke's West Campus.
I lived there then, I still do.
You have been in an apartment, living in an apartment, a ground floor apartment, since the late 60s.
Yeah.
Almost 40 years.
Well, you and your 2 brothers were in it.
Yeah, of course, I understand, but well, what prompted life in an apartment for 3.5 decades?
Well, one of the things was that my mother and I built the apartments. So we owned the land, bought the land, built the apartments. And it's nice to be your own landlord. So when I got married, I'd been living at home. I was 38 when I got married, had a child bride, your mother. And so we moved into an apartment, and then my mother and I developed this apartment project right out near Duke, which was very convenient. And so my wife and I moved in there, and we liked it, and you know, it was handy. Why move somewhere else? So we just stayed there.
Mm.
But going back to that that article, that reminds me of the fact that I've been called a gadfly, I've been called a troublemaker sometimes, but I hope my motives were okay. When I began that litigation, what I was concerned about was that the government, at that point, the federal government, was requiring the congressional districts be organized so that some of them were majority-minority. Majority black was another term for it. And they would create these strange districts which were designed to assure that an African American was elected to Congress. It was sort of a quota system, and they used the new technology, computer technology, to split things up in such a way that it would be assured practically that African Americans would be elected from the particular districts. It was sort of it was sometimes referred to as pack black, bleach white, because that meant the other districts would contain a very, very small percentage of African Americans. And I thought that was wrong to be setting up a system to elect people on the basis of race. I didn't think a quota system was constitutional, and I thought somebody should do something about it. And so we went ahead and did something. I got 5 people together, myself being one of them. You were one of them. I remember getting you into it. You were a student then, studying political science at Wake Forest, and this gave you a chance to learn about political science. Another was a fellow professor of mine at Duke Law School who was a very dedicated person in connection with trying to assure colorblind society. And then there was a lady who had been a client of mine. She was a widow of a professor who had been killed in a very tragic accident. And she'd been on the election board, and she was sort of a crusader for fairness and equality in a colorblind society. And so she was the lead plaintiff. And the 5 of us sued everybody. We sued the president. I guess we sued the Attorney General of the United States. We sued the North Carolina legislature. We relied on the federal Constitution primarily. And it was really a strange situation. The administration at that time was the Bush administration. It was not famous, the first Bush administration, which was not famous for affirmative action. But in this area, this field of racial gerrymandering, that was a big thing because they figured that if they could pack blacks, as it were, the other districts would be more likely to elect Republicans, and that ultimately they could be a majority. I didn't know this at the time, but we learned about it. So in North Carolina, they insisted on having 2 majority-minority, majority-black districts. And these were the strangest things you ever saw, which is why I knew that they were racially gerrymandered. I mean, the way they took Durham, for example, and split it up. It had a district extending from Durham all the way down to Gastonia, just as wide as a highway, not any wider. It's so strange. And later I learned that it had a political motivation. But the irony was that in North Carolina, the legislature, which was controlled by Democrats, was able to figure out a gerrymander which did that, and also gerrymandered the other districts so that the Republicans would not take control. And the Republicans actually attacked the district that was created, attacked the plan that was created. And so ultimately we sued, 5 of us as individuals, all Democrats. And then in turn, we lost in the trial court 2-1 on a motion. They just threw us out. Basically, said these guys don't have anything, why waste our time? Well, we decided we'd appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. You could go directly there. And the Supreme Court granted review of the case. They decided to grant review. And that was a strange situation because at that point, the Republican Party intervened on our side. And there were other groups that intervened on our side, one of them being the American Jewish Congress, as I recall. And on the other hand, on the other side, they had these amicus briefs and everything, the ACLU, various others, the NAACP. And so we're there in the Supreme Court with sort of a strange alignment. And the Supreme Court rules in our, it was right at the end of the Supreme Court term, just like the other day they handed down at the end of the term the cases on detainees. And the Supreme Court said we were right. You can't do that sort of thing. You can't racially gerrymander. And sent it back for a trial. At that point, the state said, well, it really wasn't racial gerrymandering anyway. But we were able to prove to the contrary, and at least to the satisfaction of the Supreme Court. Because we had to go back up there again, we were successful again. And they said to the North Carolina legislature, you got to change this. And then they drew other plans. But that was something I worked on for 8 or 9 years, and it's one of those things you get involved in, you want to make sure it's carried out right. You just don't stop.
I think I read in an article in the Raleigh News and Observer when you were recognized as the Tar Heel of the Week that it was absurd what was being done. I could not reconcile it with cases I was teaching in law school, particularly ones dealing with race neutrality and jury selection. Will you share with the viewers a little bit about why some of those cases really mattered and how that impacted your thinking?
Well, the Supreme Court had ruled in various cases that peremptory challenges, that is, challenges that are given to jurors, where you can challenge a juror, those challenges should not be exercised on the basis of race. You shouldn't be able to challenge someone because he or she is black or white, nor should you be able to challenge them because they're male or female, for that matter. But the idea is to protect the important right of service on a jury and the important right of a party to a trial to have juries that are not racially gerrymandered or racially selected. And so when I saw the redistricting plan in North Carolina, the congressional redistricting plan in 1992, when it was very obvious that it was racially gerrymandered, I said, this is very strange. They will protect the right to jury service, but meanwhile, the right of voters to vote without regard to race is being tanked, is being thrown away, disregarded. So that belief that the premise was being violated, the fundamental principle was being violated, was what motivated me to try to do something about it.
So the idea that you couldn't use race for the second most important right you have as a citizen, the right to be on a jury.
Sure.
But you could, and the alternative, use it for the most important right you have as a citizen, the right to vote.
Didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And I still don't think it makes sense. The Supreme Court, in some of the later cases, has taken a position that is a little disappointing to me. They say that if redistricting is done for predominantly racial motive, then it is unconstitutional. But it's got to be predominantly racial. Now that gets into some interesting wordplay. For example, the voting record of African Americans has traditionally been very heavily weighted toward Democrats. And so, in fact, in some instances as high as 85 and 90%, although that's changing. But suppose a district is created using the computer, which is predominantly African American, and the district is obviously created with that purpose. But instead of admitting that it's racial, the legislature says, the members of the legislature that drew the plan say, oh no, this is predominantly political. We didn't choose these people because they were African Americans. We chose them because they predominantly voted Democratic. And the Supreme Court has seemed to say that if the racial motive is concealed in that manner, then the result is permissible. To me, that gives too much of a loophole. But anyway, that's the way the court has done it. As a result, in North Carolina at least, you probably can do better attacking redistricting or reapportionment plans under the state constitution than you can under the federal constitution. So we've got some strange things going on. But at least the Supreme Court has said, if it is predominantly racial, then it's unconstitutional.
You know, that same article in the Charter of the Week, Joe Neff's piece in the Raleigh News and Observer, talks about you adhering to the notion of the colorblind society and really pursuing that. He then talks about Everett's 10 years as chief judge on the Court of Military Appeals, essentially the U.S. or the Supreme Court for U.S. military, helped him arrive at this position. Analogous to the Supreme Court, the civilian court hears final appeals from courts martial. But then he goes on to say the military is pretty well established a colorblind society where things are done on merit without the quota system. Can you share with the viewers how he got that perception in talking to you, or how you believe he did?
Well, one of the things that motivated me in the redistricting litigation was that it seemed you could put into place plans that were racially neutral. And one of the best examples of that is the military. In 1947, when Harry Truman basically integrated the armed forces and tried to take race out of the picture, people said it wouldn't work, but it has. And the military, I think, do the best job of all in being colorblind. I'm sure there is some discrimination in particular instances, but their policies are very clear. No racial discrimination. Now, in addition, no sexual discrimination. They've tried to eliminate that as well. And so I think the military has in many instances given some fine examples for the way things should be done. The Supreme Court has referred to the military as a separate society, and in many ways it is. But there's some aspects of that separate society which make very good sense indeed, and which are beacons for civilian society.
Joe Neff also points out a former student of yours, a Duke Law graduate, the former Speaker of the House, North Carolina Speaker of the House, Dan Blue, who went on to say, obviously speaks warmly of you as a professor, still using a nickname common among Duke Law students, quote, in an ideal setting, what Robbio talks about is a good thing that I agree with, but we don't live in an ideal world. That's Dan Blue, the former Speaker of the House there in North Carolina. What about that aspect? I mean, is it because you don't live in an ideal world that you therefore don't pursue ideal goals? Or, I mean, what do you think he's referring to directly?
Well, I respect Dan Blue a great deal. He's a former student, and I'm very fond of him. But I think he's wrong to say that, you know, it isn't an ideal society. People do things because of race or gender or ethnicity. Because they do it, it's not worth the trouble to try to change things. I think what you have to do is always keep an ideal in sight and strive for it. It may be very difficult to attain, but that's not a reason to not try for it. So basically what he was saying was that you couldn't avoid racial gerrymandering in our society, and therefore why bother? And I disagree with that. I think maybe you find it's very difficult to avoid. Maybe you won't be able to avoid it, but at least try. And I think there are a lot of things in life that you have to at least try to do, even recognizing that there may be an uphill battle.
Absolutely. Ted, talking a little bit about that piece of your 10 years of service as Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Military Appeals, now the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, is a good segue. When did you first get active in the military?
I enlisted in the Air Force Reserve in 1950, soon after I got out of law school. And later, I applied to be a JAG and was commissioned as an Air Force First Lieutenant, and then went on active duty. That was right at the end of the year, the school year, when I'd been teaching at Duke. And that basically terminated my service as a teacher for quite a while, and instead put me in Air Force uniform. And I went out to West Texas at a base out there. And it was rather interesting. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the statute that governs courts-martial, had come into play into effect in May of 1951. And I went on active duty in August of 51. And for some reason, they did not send me through a training program. Some of the other JAGs were sent, but I wasn't. So I was sent out to West Texas to learn OJT, on-the-job training. And what an interesting situation that was, because it was a new law that had just taken effect, and nobody really fully understood it. So that was my first contact with military justice, and in a sense with the military, because I had not been on active duty before for an extended period of time. And then I served on active duty and was ultimately released. I served a little more than a couple of years during the Korean War, and really loved it in many ways. But I decided I'd go back to civilian life. On the other hand, I later decided that I would stay in the reserve, and did so for a total of 28 years, active duty and reserve time. So in my reserve assignments, I kept in touch with the military and military justice. Also, I took a position. It was pure coincidence that I was offered it, but I took a position as a commissioner of the Court of Military Appeals. Now, that court had been created in 1951 as part of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It provided civilian review of courts-martial for the very first time. Up to that time, you have the military conducting a trial, and the Judge Advocate General would look at it in the particular service, and that would be the end of the road. The president could give a pardon or something of that sort, but basically there was no no civilian judicial review. And Congress thought that it was important to have that, and to have a review that would be by civilians, uniform for all the services. It would be the same type of review. And so this court had come into being. And I went on the staff as a commissioner, which meant that I was a principal assistant for one of the judges. There were 3 judges. Interestingly, each of them had been personally interviewed by Harry Truman before he appointed them. I don't think anybody has done that since then.
Yeah.
And he would nominate them, and then, of course, the Senate had to act on the nomination. And it was a fascinating court to work with. There were 3 judges, one who had a background in each of the armed forces.
Oh.
And the one I was working with had an Air Force background. In fact, he'd been on active duty as, he was a reservist. He was on active duty as a bird colonel at the very time that he was appointed to the court. And so it was a fascinating place where I learned a lot about military justice. And I decided that it would be interesting to write this up, put it into a book that not only lawyers but laypersons could read and understand.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1956, I was able to get published a book called Military Justice in the Armed Forces of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that book had, I hope, simple, understandable text and a lot of the legal stuff in footnotes, so that a lawyer could read it and get from the footnotes some of the technical stuff, and other people could read it and understand what it was about.
Yeah. Did you have many book signings with that, Dad? When you
No.
were around? Not too many books.
No, nobody seemed to be interested in having a book signed.
Well, we could rehash that. Bet we could check with Mickey Spillane and see what we could do about that. He'd give you some pointers.
Well, Mickey's books were selling pretty well at that time. I still remember I, the jury, you probably talked to him about some of those books. But, in any event, I did get a book out, and I found getting it published was probably harder than getting it written in some respects. But after that book, and this is apropos of your question about contact with the military, after that book, I, in addition to staying in the reserve as a JAG, did a few cases where I would represent people, like in a court-martial or something. And I was active later in the American Bar Association. I was a member of and later chair of their military law committee, so I had a lot of contact that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that kept up until 1980 when President Carter appointed me to the court.
Yeah, I'm going to share with the viewers a little bit about that appointment. I'm reading from an article back in March of '99 highlighting the incoming recognition for the Judge Advocates Association of their new honorary award, which was presented that first year. But it talks about when it was time to select a chief judge in 1980. The selection process was a love-in for the 14-person selection committee. And an article by Jonathan Lurie reads in part, an imposing figure with a sleepy smile that concealed a sharp legal intellect. Everett knows both the incumbent judges at that time, and he gets along well with them. But Everett possesses more than experience and expertise, and he goes in to talking about some of that previous experience. Maybe he was writing the book back in '56. It was the involvement with the court back in '53. And for a few years before going back to Duke Law School. But it was that, and he later writes, under his leadership, the court reached out to Judge Advocate Generals, emphasizing a commonality of justice rather than a clash of jurisdictions. Thus, his appointment signaled both the end of an era and the advent of a new chapter in the court's history. I don't think I understood the magnitude until a guest was in here a few months ago, Tommy Britton, a local attorney, who's a JAG officer as well, and he, after the interview, connected the two of us. It was exciting hearing him talk about the impact you had on the military courts and on the military itself.
Well, at that particular time, just before I was appointed, the court had not been getting along very well with the Department of Defense. And there was sort of a battle going on between the chief judge of the court on the one hand and the General Counsel of DOD on the other. And in fact, the General Counsel had recommended the court be eliminated. It got that serious. And at the time I was appointed, and I was appointed to fill the vacancy created by the departure of a very famous judge here in South Carolina, Matthew Perry.
Oh, yeah.
They've got a courthouse named for him up in Columbia. Anyway, Matt Perry had been on the court and then came back to South Carolina to be a district judge. But at the time that I was appointed, in addition between the battle between DOD and the chief judge had a very different philosophy, apparently, than the other judge. It was three-judge court then, and there were two of them that couldn't agree. They didn't even were not even having hearings because they were waiting for somebody else to come and sort of resolve some of the issues. So there were enough problems. It made it a real challenge. Fortunately, I was on good terms with both the judges. One of the other interesting things was at that time, and this is no longer true, the president had the authority to designate somebody as the chief judge. As for example, when I came on, right at that same time, I not only became a judge, but the chief judge, because President Carter designated it that way. And the chief judge became the junior judge, which is a little difficult, sort of to adapt to. But anyway, that was the situation. That's been changed so that now the chief judge serves for 5 years. It's based on seniority. So there I was as a new judge and also the new chief judge. And the then chief judge had been, in a sense, demoted to being associate judge. It was a challenging period. And the services were having a terrible time then because of the drug war. The caseload of the court had been in the, say, range of about 1,600 a year at the time I arrived. And then, lo and behold, it got up to about 3,400. And some other things happened that were interesting. One of the judges who was there, one of the judges who was there when I arrived retired. The second judge, who had been the chief judge before I arrived, had some health problems, and he ultimately was given a medical retirement. Well, to fill one of the vacancies, there was appointed a wonderful judge. He'd been a judge, trial court judge here in South Carolina. His name was Walter Cox, of a very distinguished family, very well-known family in South Carolina. I think his dad had been president of Clemson, and Walter had been a trial judge. I think he also had been an outstanding football player for the Clemson Tigers early on.
That's right.
But in any event, there were just the two of us for about a year and a half. And the caseload jumps up from about 1,500 to 3,400, somewhere in there.
Lord.
And we're waiting for a third judge, of course, but meanwhile, fortunately, we had enough similarity in judicial philosophy. We were able to get a lot of cases out of the way. And we worked hard at it and kept things relatively current. And Walter was a great guy to work with. He later became chief judge, retired from the court. He's now a partner or of counsel with the Nelson Mullins firm down in Charleston.
Sure.
Yeah. But it was a very interesting time. For example, the Supreme Court in 1969 had handed down a decision saying that in the United States, a service member can be tried for a crime under the Uniform Code if the crime is service-connected. Overseas, he can be tried for anything, whether or not it was service-connected. Well, what does it mean to be service-connected? For example, what if I possess drugs? If I possess it on base, service-connected, but what if I go off-post about 100 yards to conduct a drug deal or to puff cocaine, marijuana, whatever? then it was not service-connected according to some of the decisions. Very confusing situation. And ultimately, the Supreme Court in 1987, I think it was, after I'd been on the court about 7 years, reversed the earlier case and said, if you're in the military, it makes no difference whether what you do is service-connected or not, whether the military can try you. So that eliminated a lot of questions and a lot of issues. It eliminated questions as to whether someone who raped a woman off post could be tried by court-martial or not, and so forth.
Wow, yeah.
So a lot of exciting issues.
This piece in the Judge Advocates Association publication talked about all of your students are as devoted to him as he is to them, to you. Almost every place he goes, he sees a former student. He has an encyclopedic memory. On visits to our military sites, he has a habit of writing a note to everyone he sees, from the commanding generals to the lowest ranking, to come visit his court, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. One day an E-4 arrived at the court unannounced. Judge Everett was delighted and remembered she had been one of his drivers. He made her queen for the day, gave her a personal tour, and took her to lunch. You know, one of your court clerks said, no surprise, he is very busy, but he loves people. He knows no station in life. He is always very inquisitive, whoever you are. You have something he wants to know about. You have something he wants to know about. And I tell you, that just encapsulated the last couple days and encapsulated your life. Your involvement of really being interested in others, Dad's been there. When did that start? Can you think back as to when you began being interested in others?
I can't say there was a beginning point. I guess I was sort of born that way or trained that way by my mother and dad. They love people, and they sort of trained me to love people.
You think both of them love people? I mean,
Absolutely.
They were really, yeah.
Absolutely.
I know we talked about that a couple days ago about both your mom and dad's involvement, both in rearing you, both as being attorneys there in Durham for so many years. You know, and that really segued well into y'all's involvement with the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it was back in 1954. The three of y'all were sworn in together. Can you share with the viewers what that was like 50 years ago?
Well, it was quite an experience. It was the first time in the history of the court that a family had been sworn in together. I guess one reason for that was there hadn't been that many women lawyers. And so the three of us appeared in April of 1954. I was at the Supreme Court recently for something and had them check as to when I was admitted, and they had a little bit of an error. They showed different times for us, and they corrected that. So, and it was April, and about a month before Brown was decided. I frankly had thought that it was on the same day that Brown was decided, but it was different.
You then went back 40 years later, as we talked about yesterday and the day before, to argue your first trip as both, not only as a plaintiff, but as the attorney for the plaintiffs in the U.S. Supreme Court, and then went on to argue 3 cases following in that same thing. 4 cases over a 9-year period in the U.S. Supreme Court, Dad. I mean, an attorney having the opportunity to go once, but you were up there 4 times over the last decade.
I'm sure they got tired of me.
Yeah, tired of it. I mean, what was that like? Can you share with the viewers? We got a couple of minutes.
Well, one of the things you try to do is get prepped for it. I was given moot court preparation. I think in one of them, one of the people who was testing me was a lawyer who currently is the Solicitor General, Ted Olson. So we had some very fine people who, you know, sort of put you through the paces that you'll go through with the Supreme Court. One of the things I did that I think was the most successful was to use a map showing how, very vividly, how the gerrymandering had been done. That was in the first case, Shaw v. Reno. And I noticed those justices were sitting there, particularly Justice O'Connor, just fascinated by that map. And if you looked at the map, you knew exactly what had happened, no matter what people said. I thought that would be very good, very effective, because I remembered a case we had had where the defense was in our court of military appeals, where the defense said that there'd been racial motivation in the challenging of members of the court martial, that persons had been taken off on the grounds of race. And the counsel for the defendant had chessmen, red and white, or black and white, I guess, and used them to illustrate, pulling one chess block off to show that a white had been taken off, or an African American, as the case might be, use that for illustration. And I remembered how impressed I was. You're sitting there listening to a lot of arguments, and it's nice when somebody does something different. Right. So I decided I would do something different by having that map sitting there confronting him during my entire argument. And it really worked out.
And it did, absolutely. Y'all came out 5-4 in your favor, and then later 5-4 in your favor, and then a couple not in your favor.
5-4 against us.
Against, that's right.
I think switch positions.
Is that right? Yeah. We got a couple of minutes, Dad. One thing we didn't highlight over the last couple of days is the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at Duke Law School, which you founded in 1993. Of course, we got a segue into that video that Chuck Stokes did back in February of 2000. But I wanted you to put a quick plug in for the center.
Absolutely. I'd been teaching national security law at Duke, Carolina, and Wake Forest. I decided it would be very important to have some courses and some organized study and research in the field of national security as it related to legal issues like terrorism, things of that sort. So I organized a center, and we've done a lot of things. We have conferences, we've sponsored lectures. Our executive director, Scott Silliman, is on TV almost all the time now talking about terrorism, things of that sort. So it was a situation where we hit something that was very, very important, and I'll extend an invitation to all of your viewers to come see us up at Duke and learn what we're doing in that center.
Great. Lastly, Dad, the biggest inspiration for you as you think back on your life, what has been the biggest inspiration that's kept you going, kept you focused, and just kept you strong?
I think primarily family, but hopefully also religious faith. I guess that's a basic thing. And then having a wonderful family, my parents, my wife, my 3 sons, that keeps you going and helps motivate you. You feel you want to do something that they can be proud of. And hopefully I've done a few things that you and your brothers and your mother and my parents were proud of.
Thanks so much for being with us this morning, Dad.
A pleasure to be here.
Absolutely.